it's not happening in secret. Yeah, I think it has a little button that says live, which we must believe. Okay, so we are live on YouTube. So ideally, we should not do anything embarrassing from this point on. Um, and at any point, would you want to just share audio or something like that? Do we Should we do a test for that or?
Oh, I don't have any audio.
Okay. Okay, excellent. I think I will begin. Um, just introducing this talk. So, I'm Urvi, and I'm a member of AFPP, which is Artists for Progressive Politics, and it's a collective of artists and creatives um, who are in support of progressive politics in India and elsewhere. And so far, we've been working alongside left organizations in India. So we have certain affiliations with some of them, and we've been trying to, for example, create an online presence for some of them, or to amplify certain campaigns of theirs. We're very pleased to have Tings Chuck with us. She is an artist, writer, and organizer whose work contributes to popular struggles across the global south. Her current research focuses on the art of national liberation struggles. She received her Master of Architecture from the University of Toronto and is the author and illustrator of Undocumented, The Architecture of Migrant Detention. She leads the art department of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and is currently based in Shanghai. And today she's going to be sharing some experiences about art movements and national liberation struggles from Cuba to South Africa to Indonesia, and how they built a theory and practice based on internationalism and solidarity with the working and oppressed masses of the world. And then in her work, she poses the question of how these movements help inspire and inform our work today, and to help us build an international network of artist activists and cultural workers. um, just some house rules. Throughout the talk, you can write down your questions in the chat, which everybody has access to. We're going to remain on mute so that we can listen to her better. I will also be on mute soon enough. But you can place your questions there. The talk will go on for about 30-40 minutes, and then we'll have about 10-15 minutes for questions. If anybody's watching this on YouTube, you can also place questions in the YouTube chat. We'll be checking those as well. Um, and yes, so I will allow things now to take over. Yeah.
Thanks, Urvi. Thank you to all the friends and comrades who've invited me here today to share some experiences with you and to also learn from the experiences there that you're having in India and as the organization of Artists for Progressive Politics. We've been actually, creepily on the internet following some of the work you've been doing as you've appeared on the scenes in the last months, and we were very excited to finally connect. So thank you for that invitation. We're very pleased. So as you already mentioned in the beginning, that I am part of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, which is a social movement-based research institute. So it's a little bit different in character. Um, what we write about, think about, research about, and speak from the perspective of are the social movements as the basis across the global south. So our offices are based in India and Delhi, in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, as well as in Johannesburg, South Africa. So we work internationally, connected with many mass-based popular social and political movements. And my part here, and why I think it would be of interest to this group today, is the work of art, both in production, theory, and history, trying to revive, reconnect many of these inspirational histories that often are fragmented or left out of the art history books or the art classes or design classes, but are very, very much essential for us today in the kind of global climate we live, not only because of the global pandemic we're all facing in various regions, but also because of what the different people struggles are demanding. And I don't need to tell the comrades in India who have seen kind of such inspirational big uprisings in the last months. So before I dive right into it, I have to admit, unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be able to take us all the way to Indonesia, since the timing probably won't allow, but I will be sure to bring us to some elements of Cuba, South Africa, and some parts in between. So I don't know if anyone, unfortunately, we can't do an interactive thing here, but I don't know if anyone has seen or recognized this, and I'll assume some people say yes, and then I'll respond anyway, is that this is something of an old, let's say, publication. And I'm going to share with you my first experience experiencing this. It's pretty much the size of a book. I look small in for the book, but the book is huge. So I'll share a little story with you. I'm in the musty basement of the Marx Memorial and Library in London. I find Mariana. She is buried among piles of posters. She is the volunteer responsible for digitizing its vast archive of posters. I am taken to a small office where Lenin spent 2 years while in exile writing for Iskra, which means spark in Russian, the underground Bolshevik newspaper in the ideological heart of the party. And on the desk sits this enormous book, the one that I'm right now floating in, collecting issues of the paper. And on the, so here, this is his desk where he wrote. And here on the wall, there's a framed map on the wall. There's red arrows detailing the distribution of the paper throughout Russia and Europe. It actually it's a distribution map of where the paper went around. And it's a reminder not only how complicated it is to get physical publications across different borders, but it reminds of many lives that were actually lost or risked so that this publication could find its readers. So when you look at the actual design of this, one of the first things I felt was it's kind of hard to read. I think in this Instagram and social media age, I would challenge anyone here of us younger generation of designers and artists and militants and activists to actually spend time looking at and studying this. And from a design perspective, when you look at it, it talks about a kind of frugality of space, as if the lack of space to breathe in the drawings is also talking about how difficult the material conditions it was to produce this actual publication. And in the same place, in this basement that I'm in with Mariana, I find across this special digest of the Tricontinental. This is the original Tricontinental. I'll speak a little bit more about it, not the one that I, and as well as Comrade Mbeka, who is part of the group there, is part of. So this digest I'm seeing here is a special digest dedicated to Che Guevara. And just to remember, I'm not talking about, the random guy who wears the silkscreen t-shirt, but actually the Argentinian revolutionary Che Guevara. So this publication is undated, but I suspect it must be around the time of his CIA-backed murder when he was in the forests of Bolivia. It is an homage to the El Comandante through the many posters that OSPAL, which is the Organization for Solidarity of the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and Casa de las Americas made of him. The styles you see here are as diverse as Che's disguises. Of course, he was known as a master of disguises to get from one place clandestinely to another. It is printed in full color, one poster per page with ample margins. And it's this kind of generosity of space compared to, let's say, the Iskra, frugal space, hard to read text, that we find space for reflection and find space for breath. And as I'm flipping through it, I also notice how the quality of paper and the luxury of the ink used. This printed artifact, through its production, how it was actually produced, the labor it was taken to produce it, is itself an anti-imperialist assertion. And why is that? And I think it's important to remember that during this time, Cuba was, and until today, has been under embargo led by the United States, which means that even access to essential resources for creating such a publication, creating a poster, is limited. Most of the paper is imported to the country until today. So stepping back a little bit to explain what Tricontinental is and what these publications are, and also where we as an organization get our name from, it was a conference that was in 1966 held in Havana. It was a call to the peoples of the liberation movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to come and meet with hundreds of people coming. And it grew out of, or was born from, the non-aligned movement, which of course India was a part of, and the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization. So ASPAO, which I mentioned, was the organization that was born from this meeting, the Tricontinental meeting. And one of the primary things that ASPAO did after this conference was its publications. There was the Tricontinental Bulletin, which was more news-oriented, and then this Tricontinental Magazine, which was more analytical, more theoretical in nature. Stokely Carmichael, one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, called it the Bible in Revolutionary Circles. So in it, one of the masterpieces really of the Tricontinental Magazine is that there was this folded multilingual poster that came inside each issue. So it was a bit of a gift that you get to unwrap as you receive this publication. It was sent around the world, and at its height had 50,000 copies. Olivia Martinez, who was one of the designers, said that the poster was one of the variety of disguises, all invented with the aim of avoiding the suppression that the empire attempted to use. So the suppression being largely that embargo that was preventing materials and ideas and information from coming in and out of Cuba. So how did Cuba arrive at this point of sophistication in its production? So here I'm going to tell you another story, and it's about a man named Felix Beltran. I assume most of you have not heard about it because I didn't know about it until I started looking. So McCann Erickson, it's a global giant that still exists in advertising, opened its Havana office on the 1st of August 1944. This was pre-revolutionary Cuba. And it became one of the largest advertising company, just as the moment of advertising was becoming, an art form and a science. Now we know, quite well has dominated since. And so this publicity agent, or the advertising agency, came to Cuba just 1 year before the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista would return to power. So this is where the office was. I don't know if any of the audience here has ever seen Mad Men or is a fan of that TV series, but McCann Erickson was the rival of the main. It might just be me that likes Mad Men. So just give you a context of why Cuba was interesting for empire, for these kind of imperialist advertising agencies to establish themselves, is that in the context of Cuba, Latin America had, Cuba was basically Latin America's media darling, media capital since the 40s. It's where many of the US government and US capital had made their headquarters. A lot of the things we know about advertising now in terms of market research, how to study populations, of how to sell things to people, it was really developed as a science in Cuba. Cuba was a bit of the guinea pigs for development of US advertising. And a lot of this was about, Cuba's glorious past, the kind of mere image of Cuba as this, paradise, touristic paradise for US and everything like that. Here is, for instance, a poster celebrating the Havana Hilton in 1950s, to way to boost tourism and in the lot. So one of the things is that when the Batista, that dictator came back in power, he actually came into hired the agency, this uh, McCann Erickson, and hired them to do a citizen education project, basically how to train, as quote unquote train, the Cubans to be better hosts to U.S. tourists, how to kind of be friendlier to colonialism, let's say. And for just a note, and I'll come back later, this hotel, the Hilton, was the largest hotel in Latin America at the time. So returning to Felix Beltran, who I was mentioning, just around the time that Batista was returning to power, Felix was still a young kid. He was about 15 years old. And he started to work at McCann Erickson. He was interested in he was kind of seduced by the advertising world and that culture. And he soon after moved to New York City to study graphic design, painting, and lithography. And while this was happening, something was happening also in Cuba, which is what we call revolution, which happened in 1959. So here we have it's about at the end of 1950s, we have Fidel Castro and his 26th of July movement. Unfortunately, I have this virtual screen. You can't see my flag next to me. That would lead the Cuba to revolution and arrive in Havana on January 8th of 1959. Just 61 years. We celebrated the anniversary last month. So what did Fidel do? When he arrived in Havana, he turned the Hotel Hilton, the one that I just showed you before, into his headquarters, the headquarters of the armed resistance. And he hosted his first press conference to declare the revolution and the success of the revolution in the ballroom of the Hotel Havana. And of course, they renamed it with a new name called Havana Libre, which means Free Havana. So like Beltran, many of the Cuban artists and designers, they were trained in advertising before the revolution. But overnight, the situation would change. What happens is that you're inheriting a state that no longer is interested in selling just products to people, but they have a very sophisticated means of communication. They have a very skilled labor force of artists and designers. They have the technology. And one of the artists, he said, suddenly in 1959, we Cuban graphic artists were obliged to come to terms with a phenomenon which until then had been unknown to almost all of us. Most of us had begun our careers in advertising, but I believe it greatly helped us fuel the dynamic growth of a new form of communication. In a way, they would become the mad men and women of the revolution. So, as I had mentioned before about the imposition of the embargo till today, it's really impressive to think the kinds of inventions that they were able to do creatively that still inspire, I think, many of us in many regions who are designers and artists, especially of the political nature, of what they were able to manage. There were times where there were no paints, there was no paper. They would invent, for instance, here, taking the back of newspapers and figuring out how to do posters for films, because of course they developed a lot, their filmic industry. And another person I'd like to introduce is Alfredo Roscart, who was the artistic director of Tricontinental at the time. And he said that the embargo actually helped artists in the quest for new forms of expression, and that the limited arrival of design materials actually made them have to solve their material problems. And he said, we began to discover new forms. So one of the things I want to compare with is that unlike the muralist tradition of the Mexican Revolution, here we see Frida, and in the mural of Diego Rivera, is that the poster was a chosen form of the Cuban Revolution. It was the one that was cheaper and more responsive to the needs of the movement. It was could be mass reproduced. It had different logic. It had to reach the people, whether they were in the rural countryside, whether they were in the cities. So the poster became a constant renovation of public life, from the streets to the bulletin boards of the villages to the living rooms, because for the first time, working class people could own art in their own homes. So the poster was an accessible form of self-assertion as well as a living material culture. So returning to Felix Beltran, we left him while he was studying still in New York after the revolution had happened in Cuba. But short years later, in 1962, he would return to revolutionary Cuba and commit his education, what he had learned from the heart of empire, towards contributing to the revolution in a way of defying the scarcity that was imposed by the US economic blockade by the very tools and skills he learned inside the US advertising machine. So the kinds of work that they would do, and Russ Gart, who I mentioned, the director of Tricontinental, said, we were making anti-ads. We didn't want to sell anything. In place of that, we were interested in posters that were to educate, inform, and inspire. So they had posters about motorcycle-based health brigades. They had Akira Kurosawa neighborhood film screenings, youth celebration in the harvest. And some years later, that Felix, who began as a 15-year-old working at the US McCann Erickson, the firm hired by Batista, the dictator, he would actually become the head graphic designer for the propaganda department of the Communist Party of Cuba. So this is one of his favorite posters. He said he is still alive. As last I had seen, he is living in Mexico now. Till today, he said this is his favorite poster. It is a simple poster that was for an energy savings campaign. It is on a maripilla, just saying click, reminding the people to turn off their lights when they can. So I'm gonna now take you on a little bit of a detour, actually quite a detour, to a whole nother continent. Here, this little highlighted landlocked country is called Gaborone in Botswana. The city is Gaborone and the country is Botswana. It's 14 kilometers away from the South African border, the capital that is. And Botswana was what the Afrikaans paper. Afrikaans was the ruling the white colonialists from Dutch settlers in the apartheid Cuba, apartheid South Africa. What they had called Botswana was that they were our own Cuba, one of the newspapers had said. And why is that? And because during the anti-apartheid struggle, this country and this particular city became very important in the struggle for liberation in South Africa, because it was a place that was safe to house a lot of people who were activists and militants that were exiled from South Africa. It became an important bridge between inside and outside and what was happening. So some of people might recognize this photograph because it became quite world famous. It was around the 1976 Soweto uprising, led by Black students who were resisting the apartheid education. After the brutal crackdown against the student uprising, around 14,000 students actually fled Soweto. Many of them left the country and went into places like Botswana. Many were involved with different social political movements, student movements, from the Black consciousness movement to the Pan-African movements, and the movement for national liberation at that point was underground, called the African National Congress. We have to remember at that time, South Africa was ruled where Black majority, Black being African, people of mixed race, as well as Asians, descendants of our ancestors actually, that is Indian and Chinese indentured laborers, was ruled by a minority, white colonial minority. So when they were in Botswana, many of the organizations that were illegal, still considered illegal by the apartheid state in South Africa, formed organizations in exile. One of these organizations was a cultural organization known as the Medu Arts Ensemble. It actually operated for 7 years in Gaborone. They organize many different things, from education to creation of all kinds of things. And I'll show you a bit more of the different sectors that they organized in. They organized exchanges. And also were responsible for the circulation of a lot of revolutionary culture, from posters to music to poetry to theater. And they organized themselves around such units. Here's a poster by one of the artists, Judy Seidman. And so, as I mentioned, it was organized in film units. There was also music units, including some of the most well-known till today as jazz musicians of South Africa. There was also from graphics unit and many different publications. I think it's important to note here that, not only were there posters and newsletters, but the content itself as well. It was not only about the issues facing South Africans or African liberation struggles, but it was also much more broader international. You would find in these newsletters poetry from Vietnam, and also debates and theories that they were developing from their practice. So they were theorizing as they were producing. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember as producers today. How do we theorize, reflecting on the current moment and reflecting on what is necessary and why we produce the things we produce? And here we see something that happened tragically, is the 35th year anniversary, just past this June. But one early winter morning, the South African Special Forces actually crossed its international borders into Botswana. And the first group of them, they were heavily armed, like basically special unit, special forces. And they arrived at the home of the artist in exile, one of the key founders of Medu, Tami Mnyele. Their orders were to go into the house and basically destroy everything, leave nothing behind. 11 were killed that day, and 6 people had affiliations with Medu, whether they were members or known to. What was known was that, there were bullet holes that were completely sprayed around the place. And even from the reports of the scene of the crime, that there was India ink shattered on the floor, there were still pens uncapped, there were paintings where there were bullet holes through them. Likely, Tami was even in the process of drawing at the time of this. But the question remains, why was he targeted? Why was this group targeted? One of the things I think to look back is what the power of what this organization was doing at the time. 3 years ago, 3 years before this raid that ended in the murder of many comrades and militants, is the Culture Resistance Festival. It happened in 1982. It was both a festival of music and arts, as well as symposium where debates and presentations of papers was happening. It gathered South African and international artists alike. Officially 900 people registered, but thousands of people came, and it's not a big country nor a big city. One of the Medu members I mentioned, Judy, she said that if the inspiring words of the symposium caught up the cultural workers in their thousands, the art we saw taught us how to fly. And organized militant artists, cultural workers, learning to fly was certainly what the apartheid government was fearing. And 3 years later, we would see that 6 of these comrades affiliated with this art movement would be killed in that raid. But marching forwards, remembering forwards, this is in the image here is one of the poets from Medu and also one of the great poets of South Africa, Wally Serote. He says, "Need I remind people that armed struggle is an act of love?" I just wanted to, with this presentation about Medu, is that though 35 years ago a complete tragedy happened, and Tami Mnyele left us, there were these words that he wrote. He was quite a theoretician about the role of artists, about the responsibility of artists. Sorry for that. Responsibility for artists in the alliance of the movements of people. Sorry, comrades. We have neighbors. This is what happens. So I'm gonna say a quote from him. It was in the Medu Art Ensemble where the role of artist concretized itself. The role of an artist is to learn. The role of an artist is to teach each other. The role of an artist is to ceaselessly search for the ways and means of achieving freedom. Art cannot overthrow a government, but it can inspire change. The whole little ensemble is a workshop, a classroom, a jungle through which people must carve out a home. We relearn to live again with one another. It is the culture we mean to create, the struggle of the artist that must be rooted in the majority of our people. Any actual engagement in the making of change must, out of necessity, seek inspiration and alliance with the movement of the people. And I think this very beautifully sums up why we're even having this conversation today. That ultimately making any kind of art, as this group knows well, and why we're very excited about the work you're doing, is about seeking inspiration and alliance with the movement of the people. So here I'm going to take us back to this poster because I did take us on a very long detour. Is how we got from Cuba to Botswana. Is that I had the pleasure to speak with Mandla Langa, one of the South Africa's great poets and also Medu members. He was exiled in Botswana at the time. And he spoke about how key Medu was as a conduit between struggles inside South Africa to those struggling in exile and then to the rest of the world. He said that the comrades were very brave, that to run workshops, like printmaking workshops, to print posters, to smuggle posters. And he also talked about how songs would be brought back from the training camps outside, for example, in Zimbabwe, and back to the townships in South Africa where the songs were needed the most. And I think many of the comrades, you will not be any strangers to this. Songs and poetry became so central in the uprisings against the anti-Muslim citizenship amendments earlier this year. And even many of us far and wide were very touched by videos of renditions of Fez, Ahmed Fez poetry being sung all over by masses. So the power of transporting struggles, building solidarity, and the bravery it takes to sing those songs and to make those symbols known is something I think we should remember historically until today. And one of the things that Mandla told me, he says, there was one poster I couldn't forget. And guess what? That poster was Beltran's Click, this poster right here. He had told me how while in exile, they would be very anxiously waiting for those issues of Tricontinental magazine to arrive and inside those folded posters. And for this was the one poster he said he remembered the most. And I think we can take for granted this today in an Instagram age, that what it means to make an image seen. What does it mean for someone to see an image? And the kinds of risks it actually took. These are kind of our, let's say, lineages we follow, and lives that were even lost to make sure that these symbols are carried to new places, that the aspirations of people can be seen, and that to make the songs that carry those dreams of oppressed peoples to places where they can find their solidarity. So that speaks to us and is a reminder to us the power of image, power of an image, power of music, and power of internationalism. I'm about to kind of wrap up here at the end of near the end of my talk, and then we can exchange more questions. One of the things going back to the Tricontinental and why for us at the new Tricontinental are so inspired is that it is the spirit of internationalism. It's not a coincidence or by accident that Mandla, while in exile, finds a copy of Tricontinental. This is a very intentional aspect of not only the Cuban Revolution, but of us fallen of Tricontinental. And even looking at a survey of some of their covers, you can see their commitment to internationalism. This was something that was in the cultural policy of Cuba. And in their 1971 Congress on Education and Culture, it starts with this line of, the art of the revolution will be internationalist, at the same time as it will be tightly bound to the national roots. And it talks about the connection between the struggles of Latin America, Asia, and Africa in joined together against imperialism. And that culture and the protection of culture and cultural institution is key to that struggle. In fact, this line became the title that inspired one of our dossiers, speaking a little bit of this history that I've shared with you, called The Art of the Revolution Will Be Internationalists. After this, I can share a link with you, and it's online, it's free for download and to read. And hopefully it's something that can also nourish the organization and what you're building there. So within there, for instance, they also created the National Days of Solidarity posters. And there's just dozens and dozens of them. I really encourage anyone to go online and kind of treat yourself to looking at the OSPAL posters. But it's a call for us too, to think, oh, how do we learn more about the struggles in other regions? How do we extend the solidarity, whether through art or visuals or message? It's much easier now than trying to send a folded poster from Cuba all the way to an exiled camp in Botswana. And I'll kind of want to share one more story about the amazingness that is OSPAL, is that René Medeiros, he was the head of the design team of the Department of Revolutionary Orientation. So when the Vietnam War, which for a lot of people of this generation until today was a big inspiration or the resistance of the Vietnamese people against the brutality of US imperialism, is a huge reference for liberation struggles around the world. And when this was happening, OSPAL decided to send the head of the design team, René Medeiros, along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to actually spend months next to the soldiers in the trenches. And he was sent on an assignment to paint depictions of resistance. And unlike many of the images you might see of, oh, what is resistance against war and imperialism, he came back with a series of these paintings. They were actually images of everyday life in the trenches. They were colorful images. They were also later silk screened and turned into national Cuban postage stamps. And when asked about why he decided to represent, the resistance struggle in that way, he said, they were portraits looking towards Ho Chi Minh's revolutionary promise of a 10 times more beautiful Vietnam. So there was also a way of thinking of the projection of the people's aspirations and desires. What is the liberation struggle for? Not only the excesses of violence that imperialism places on our peoples. So with Tricontinental, why do we look into this research and why are we interested in this history? Is that we are also thinking about what is the battle of ideas today, a concept that Fidel Castro himself introduced to the general public in 1999, just over 20 years ago, that we must engage also in a cultural and ideological battle. We must confront that. And in that, for Tricontinental, for us today, we think a lot about the role of design, the role of imagery, the role of visual in this battle as well. And I'm sure this is something that is critical for the Artists for Progressive Politics. And so we look to OSPAL for a guiding light, but also thinking about how we are modifying or changing or interpreting. So the image that you shared for this event today, for instance, is an inspiration of these different posters before, but maybe today the tools we have are tablets and notebooks and pens and pencils and books, less guns, but these are also our tools in this battle of ideas. So carrying this forward, the last thing I want to leave you with is one of the projects that we've been working on as Tricontinental in conjunction with the International Week of Anti-Imperialist Struggles, which is a international platform of hundreds of different organizations across the world joined around the call for anti-imperialism. And so part of this is that we've been organizing and kind of taking back this tradition of posters and internationalism and really carrying that spirit forward, organizing a series of anti-imperialist poster exhibitions. We've had 2 so far, and we're actually launching the 3rd tomorrow. I'll end with a little image to try to do some propaganda, also to invite you all to join. The first was on capitalism, and the second was on neoliberalism, and the third is on the theme of imperialism. So we were really quite pleased. We didn't know. I mean, at first, when we had launched this campaign, we thought, oh, now we're going to have to call on all of our friends to submit some posters, or maybe we have to create some aliases and, submit posters in different names just to make the poster a success. This is the middle of a pandemic and we don't really know how this will go. But in the end, over the two calls, we've had 109 different artists from 33 countries and 25 organizations contribute work to the two exhibitions. We've also had comrades in Malaysia who have put this exhibition in a physical show there. We've had this hosted online in the website. It's at we'll share the links after, antiimperialistweek.org, in various languages. Through this, we've actually been able to meet and get to know the kind of visual cultures, but also the people behind the work, connecting, understanding what are the struggles. Through these posters, we understand what does neoliberalism look like in a place like, Papua New Guinea? What does neoliberalism look like in Cuba or other places? So it's been a way to deepen also the theoretical concepts that guide us, but also the visual language that can give those ideas more expression, make them more understandable. Ultimately, as the words I also shared of Tani Munyele, it's a way of exactly that, being inspired and being connected to and to articulate, to inspire and uplift people's struggles. That has to be at the core of why we make the art we do. So without belaboring too much more, I'm gonna just do a little advertising, shameless advertising here. Is that tomorrow we'll also launch our third one. There'll be two more, this one, Imperialism, and then the last one on hybrid war. We invite this group to contribute, but also keep dialoguing with us, because ultimately, for whether it's an exhibition, whether it's conversations like this, the goal is to be known to each other more, to share each other's work, to understand what are the issues that touch you most in different regions of the world, and exchange and be a kind of, let's say, a conduit to build that internationalism that many of the experiences I've shared so far inspire us and compel us to do. So that's what I want to share today. Thank you all. So sorry for the terrible noise behind me.
Thank you so much. I mean, we forgot the noise after a while. At least I did. So I got used to it. It felt like a soundscape. So, and thank you for taking us through many spaces, even if we didn't get to Indonesia. We have about 15 minutes, so I won't say too much, but the chat box is open for questions, or if anybody would like to discuss something in particular or say something, then yeah, this is the moment to do it.
I just also, before we while we catch these comments, I just also want to do a shout out to the fact that there are, I think, four comrades here who are from or work with Tricontinental. We have Ingrid, who is from Brazil, who is also a designer, amazing animator. We have Daniela, who's from Argentina, amazing comics artist. There's Vikas, who is not so far away, he's in Delhi. And then we have a comrade, Lynn, who is a great video artist based here in China. So just wanted to say we brought also the international group here.
So there is much praise in the chat box. No questions so far. If one of your colleagues would like, okay, yes, Kritika. I have too much power. I'm the one who mutes and unmutes people.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dennis. This was excellent. I mean, I think there's a lot of reading and researching that I'll definitely do based on your presentation. This is not really a question, but I'm just like curious to get your thoughts on. So I noticed that in all the examples that you shared with us today, aesthetically, there is a lot of like, it is very non-Western or very like non-American and non-European. So, and I can see how this is intentional and this is needed in the anti-imperialist struggle. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what role you think aesthetics play in the revolution through your anything that you've seen in your research or your work with Tribe Continental.
I think that's really, oh, I almost, just the moment I open my mouth. Um, I think that's a great question. Aesthetics is an interesting one. It's a one we actually debated quite a lot in the process of doing the anti-imperialist week and the kind of curation team that was assembled. Because there's oftentimes when we're talking about in movements, we're not interested in the bourgeois sense of aesthetics, you know, and aesthetics that is about, let's say, promoting private property or making art a consumable private commodity. And it's not just about people who have been able to get the education at the kind of elite institutions to be able to do an aesthetics that is beautiful, what is beautiful, but should be aesthetics also that responds to, that speaks to people and their experience as well. And that has it's a complicated question, but I'll speak about so I'm just saying that that's a live debate. I think it's a really pointed question for us all to think about in our regions. What is aesthetics? What is the role of that? We clearly find things beautiful. We think beauty communicates. These are important things. We think that there is a socialist aesthetics. The things I've shown you are socialist aesthetics that might not look like the traditional socialist aesthetics, like the socialist realism of the Soviet style or of that tradition, but certainly in socialist aesthetics. And the Cuba experience is interesting because there are some other quotes I didn't share today about some of the logics, especially Che Guevara, who is not a t-shirt, but a person. He actually wrote a little bit about this, about what is, you know, in terms of protesting against the socialist realism of the time. He was saying that we really need to open up space for artists, like to not give them, he called them a straitjacket, to confine them in their creativity. And so what you find in Cuba is actually they mix a lot, you know, they bring in the pre-Columbian indigenous motifs, but they also bring in like the African traditions because there's obviously a lot of Afro tradition in not only Cuba, but across Latin America. But then they also speak to exactly what was the kind of high art of the time, like pop art, psychedelic art. You'll see Che Guevara in like a totally psychedelic image. So they were also responding and sometimes I think turning it against the empire itself too, the language that were used to sell all kinds of things. So I think for them in that experience, it was something that was fascinating because it was broad and mixed. And there were times you'll see there were posters that almost have no words, you know, so they leave room for interpretation. And I think that is refreshing. And you'll see if you have a chance to look at the anti-imperialist poster exhibitions, we've gotten a lot of submissions from Cuban comrades. And you'll see how that tradition has actually continued to develop and carries a very specific. You'll find the grouping of the Cuban artists, they still carry on their own aesthetic. That is obviously after 70 years of revolution, that is a socialist aesthetic that they've developed. But no place can have, you know, there's no two places that will have the same exact, because it's historically defined too. Long answer. I see a few questions here.
Yeah, I can read some out. So, hi, thanks for doing this. We live in a time when the freedom to dissent is widely under threat. Do you feel because of this, there's more of an urgency for artists to address or challenge this? And can cultural practitioners lead that action?
Yeah, I mean, I think even some of the stories I had shared then till now, you know, art has always been powerful and therefore it has to be controlled. So I think absolutely one of the things that we have at our disposal is also we have some more ways to connect and ways to exchange art and ways to kind of channels than just, as I said, people actually smuggling them in their suitcases to cross a border. But absolutely, I think this is something that we're calling for. When we say an anti-imperialist exhibition, like that is uplifting all of the struggles that are, you know, under threat, under siege, in many of the regions, especially not many of the comrades you will know from India to Brazil to elsewhere. You know, the rise of the far right is an increasing threat for many regions for that expression, that ability to raise dissent.
Okay. We have a question from Bharat on whether a software you use for art, how much of it is easily available for artists from marginalized sections for them to create, and what kind of tools do you use?
Yeah, this is also, I think, a really live debate we had in the Team Week. One of the things that we decided that is that, you know, one of the aesthetic kind of non-requirements is how you produce, because how you produce also talks to your access to resources, exactly like this question, your access to resources, your class background, and that is not necessarily widely available to each other. And we found a lot of the submissions we received were actually hand-drawn, very kind of with a more accessible, modern, kind of handcrafted pen and paper types of drawings. Beautiful. I mean, expressed a lot about what is the reality of, let's say, anti-capitalism struggles in the region. And we even highlighted in a series specifically those handcrafted posters. That was quite special. And also another thing we've been trying to find out more about is also where we can look into the free software. I mean, maybe the comrades in India can tell us more, since there's such a vibrant free software movement. What are the design tools that can be more popularized, that don't, you don't have to spend many like huge fees to pay for like an Adobe suite. At Tricontinental, many of us do use Adobe, but I think we're trying to also learn about other kinds of tools that are accessible and that we can learn and also share. But I think for a lot of people, it's actually just the cell phone, or, you know, the kind of thing that, you know, have become really sophisticated design tools too.
I think that this is a related question. Can you also tell us about the scarcity of resources and how Cuban artists made use of single link, etc., to create posters?
Yeah, so I mentioned just briefly about this. I mean, for one example is that back in that time, you're still typesetting. That is those little metals type that, you know, you set each word, you letter, and then you can, you know, then manually put the ink on and you print. But they didn't really have access to a lot of typeset. So one of the things that they would do, for instance, is reuse by, you know, cutting and pasting, you know, letters as their way of doing mock-ups, because it wasn't at the time of digital production yet, or digital typeset, and then they didn't really have access to all the type. So those are one ways I would do. And I mentioned the example of that, since paper is largely imported, how do you use other types of paper and incorporate the actual newsprint into the design? How do you incorporate it as a design element, not thinking about it as something that holds you back, but something that adds to? And they actually, with those constraints, I think many creative people have, you know, whether it's deadlines or limited resources of some kind, we know that sometimes the creativity actually does come from the constraints. When we have more constraints, we can think better. But obviously, we're not kind of romanticizing a state of embargo and the kind of hardship till today that the Cuban communists live. But there's definitely a production and an aesthetic that was produced out of that, that was a result of that. And I think as Marxists, we always have a historical understanding, materialist understanding of, you know, the forms that are created. They're not just happenstance. And I'm trying to think of other stories. There are stories of where there were not only, you know, one or two inks available. So you learn another way of thinking about color theory. You know, you kind of, you don't go from, oh, I have this palette available. You say, okay, these two they don't really work together. How can I make them work? And you might actually come out with surprising results. So those are some of the stories in terms of reading and researching that I could come across, but I'm sure there's countless more.
Mandira has a comment that the background sound became rhythmic after a point of time, and it's definitely a part of how our everyday unfolds. We should embrace such everyday noises. They make the experiences more natural and raw. And I'm just going to unmute Pratyush Raj, who has a question.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Hello. Thank you for this session. It was lovely. Like regarding an earlier question, you mentioned about the aesthetics and with like you mentioned that like art and revolution will be international but rooted in like the particular culture which like they worked around. My only question is that like with particular aesthetic, there comes a very like they're rooted in different cultures, and like how do you approach these particular aesthetics which are deeply rooted in cultures to bring them to an international list, international concern, and like how do they mobilize on an international level, and also like how do you think that like this new medium of social media can help mobilize people in a better way, if this makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a really one of those um, very key and confounding questions for us, at the same time of wanting to build a commonality, a common set of kind of basic, let's say, human values, let's call them broadly socialist values, kind of idea about a world we want to build. But we also can't ignore that that's the kind of very specific circumstances that we all, and conditions that we come from. Um, I mean, this might seem like a kind of a trite or kind of not important example, but I remember one of the global meetings we were planning for Tricontinental. Now we have about 35 people working internationally. We had a global meeting in South Africa, and we were organizing some of the designs for our own, gathering. And then we were picking colors. And we're like, okay, what is the palette of Tricontinental? We have these colors, and color theory goes out the window in any context you go to. And then at some point we had chosen this sort of, let's say it was a kind of saffron. And then we started saying, oh yeah, that's a beautiful color. We were designing in Brazil, it's great, lovely. And I was like, I don't think this works for a whole region of the world. Saffron is a very politically loaded color for our Indian comrades. And started thinking, I mean, I'm just using this example as those kinds of questions that come up when you design and you try to think of an international lens, but there's never going to be one answer. I think one of the things that give us a unity, let's say, is even when you look through, I had it in my background, the kind of dozens and dozens of posters of a image of I think the last one I showed was neoliberalism, was about struggles against neoliberalism. When you look at the particulars inside, how each symbol is used, which fonts are chosen, how scripts are written, how people are represented, what are the symbols of struggle, you'll see a big difference. You'll see a wealth of difference, let's say, not a kind of confusing difference, but there is a kind of unity, I think, that is created in actually, okay, well, we actually believe that the public sector, that the state is important in protecting the people's well-being. We believe in public education. We believe in public health. We believe that the people's, well-being is more important than the profit. So these kinds of elements actually come through somehow aesthetically, even if they're not in the very particular, the particular symbol, let's say. Might be a kind of way for us to think about in the kind of multitude. There is a way we find some unity, some kind of common aesthetics almost. If you look at through it all, you'll see a kind of common aesthetics, even if it's not in the traditional sense of it.
Okay, and perhaps this can be our last question. What tools or strategies have you found in your work and research that activists, artists, practitioners, or theorists, and those in between, can deploy to resist being appropriated or absorbed by the imperial project, especially as the face and manifestation of capitalism mutates?
Okay, I see. I think actually, this is a big question. I think before this, it was linked to this. I also wanted to invite any of our comrades that are from the Tricontinental are interested in answering some of these questions about tools and strategies, responses. This is something, a good moment for us to also share, since this is very much a collectively done work, and I'm just the speaker for tonight. Does anyone have anything to say? Danny, Ingrid, Vikas? I can keep talking until you can think about it, but okay, great. Let's unmute them everyone, and then we can I can start here.
Did you say you'd like me to unmute?
Yeah,
Yeah.
mute Daniela and Ingrid, and if they want to join in, they can. I'm going to try to answer it piece by piece. So tools or strategies found in your work and research that activists and practitioners and those in between can deploy to resist being appropriate. Oh, so this I think is a big question, right? I mean, I was almost joking about the Che Guevara t-shirt, but that probably is one of the biggest symbols of the left that get appropriated by the right. And this is throughout constant, repeating after again. In fact, I think the cycle from taking it from the streets and from the people's struggles to a t-shirt is probably way faster now than ever before. It's like instantaneous almost. But I think the thing is, we don't necessarily have to own, let's say, those images. We don't have a financial interest in it. We don't have a personal interest in it. But I think there is an important part of even education for ourselves to know where those symbols come from. What do they mean? If those symbols still carry weight and still reflect and have meaning for people's struggles, that it's ours. It can't be actually commodified or sold or bought easily. I almost see anytime someone has a Che Guevara shirt that you'll see in Che Guevara bumper sticker or whatever it is. That's actually an invitation to have a conversation. That's not, someone made a little money off of it, not very much, but that's actually an invitation. There are times that we can bring it up. Just the other day, I was having a conversation with someone about the now famous peace dove. The white peace dove is kind of a symbol of international movement and the symbol of the World Peace Council, which is now not a very active organization, but was a very important communist international peace kind of platform. And I said to her, she's a young designer, and I said, "Oh, do you know who designed that?" And she's like, "I don't know." I'm like, "Have you seen it before?" She's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "It's probably Picasso." And he's like, "Oh, that's interesting." We all have some imagination of Pablo Picasso, if not anything, at least those strange geometric shapes and women's bodies and I don't know, something like that, at least some image. And I was like, "Did you know he was a communist? Do you know he was a huge proponent of the anti-imperialist and anti-fascist symbol and why he did that after the bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and was inspired to create that image?" I mean, as much as images seem like they can be co-opted or so far from its roots, we can take those back and claim them because they are fully ours. And I see Ingrid, Daniela has a point. Jump in. I think she needs to be unmuted still.
We can't hear you, Danny.
Oh, now you hear me. Oh, so sorry. And I'm very grateful to be here and listening to you things talk about this and all the questions very, very rich. And I'm thinking I'm addressing your points, things about like we can own these things, because I think that one of the strategies, I agree with the verb of mutating, like, yeah, it's tricky. It's very, very tricky to you have to be very alert about how the images are being used. And the Che Guevara is a clear example. And I, as an Argentinian, can assure you that you can find like whatever you want as a product and with the chain, the face in shoppings and things like that. And I for myself, I kind of I feel closer to the terms of appropriationism, and in this very Latin American thing to do, like take things, that we have this movement, this Brazilian movement that was amazing, that was this symbolic anthropophagy, symbolic cannibalism thing that they take so much from us, so we take all of that mestiçage, all of that cultural elements, and we take what we can use for our artists and political objectives, and we discard the rest. And so I think that some strategies of the Cuban posters are good examples, as you mentioned, things about this use of psychedelic aesthetics or pop, very, very pop art, but in other context and in other type of circulation. And I think that this is a key concept as well, because it's not just the work of art itself, it's also the context of the circulation of that piece of art. So, and the content, but when you use these visual elements and these very heavy symbolic elements, how do you use it, and how and in which context they circulate, and in which medium, because it's not the same. Not all the mediums are the same. So posters is one thing, as you clearly explain things, and a canvas is another. So those decision makings are all part of the work of the artist. So just like assuming that, just that.
Yeah. I think, well, thank you all for this space. It's amazing. Thank you, Tings. Just to add a little, maybe, to everything they both said, I think maybe having a space like this, you know, a collective space for artists to work together is a way to think about this as a tool, not to fall into the enemy's trap, let's say. It's a space we think collective in a collective way, and also as a project, as a part of a bigger project, you know. I think that makes a huge difference when you're making the art and you have a project to be a part of, and the people you want to reach, the people you want to talk to, is also an important thing to think while you're producing.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, I think we're going to have to bring this to an end. Unless Tings, you have something that you might want to close with, so I can come back to you.
I think I was well captured by my comrades here, but would just like to extend a big thank you to everyone here for organizing and for inviting us. I hope we get to exchange more, and I think this is just the beginning of something great.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're also, AFPP is a few months old, and we're hoping to do much more and talk to more people. So thank you so much for sharing this, and to Ingrid and Daniela as well, and for all the questions. So just a little bit of promotion from our side. You can follow us on AFPP India, which is the handle on Twitter and Instagram, and you can find us on Facebook. The last talk was done by Sudhanva Deshpande, and this talk we had Tings, and we plan to do many more. So you can keep yourself in the loop by liking and sharing and subscribing and those things. And I will share the links in the chat as well. And again, thank you very much for being here, and we hope to see you again. You can also write to us. There, I've got it. No, I haven't got it. I'm sending it to everyone. You can also write to us at afppindia@gmail.com if you are based in India or would like to do something related to the Indian context, and we can have a conversation. And Tings has put these links, which he had promised earlier. So yes, chat box is full of things now. All right. Thank you so much for being here.
Take good care, everyone.
You too. Bye.